From Boca Raton, Florida, this is Behind the Bima. On this episode, Rabbi Goldberg is joined by Yonasan Rosenblum, a renowned Jewish journalist and the director, spokesperson, and founder of Jewish Media Resources. Known for his in-depth analysis and captivating storytelling, Yonasan explores the historical narratives that have shaped the Jewish world and discusses their relevance today. Yonasan delves into the themes of resilience and continuity in Jewish history, offering his perspectives on how understanding our past can empower our spiritual growth. Yonasan also shares his insights on the challenges of preserving Jewish identity in the modern world, the interplay between tradition and innovation, and his personal journey as a writer. Plus, thoughts on the contributions of key Jewish figures throughout history, and the importance of nurturing a sense of unity and community responsibility. All this and more, Behind the Bima.
Rav Jonathan, Rav Yonasan, I'm not sure which to call you or both. Really, I think in itself is a reflection of how complex you are, how nuanced you are, and how much there is to you. But it's a great pleasure to be together again, and I thank you for going Behind the Bima. Very excited to learn about the new book, and Ordinary Greatness, which you've really taught the world and shared in so many of the platforms that you share on. It's been a long time since you were in Boca Raton for a Shabbos, but we still remember fondly. And I gobble up your article every week and enjoy it. It's one of my must-read as I flip through mostly advertisements and skip other sections. But
no, a lot of material in this book.
Thank you for making your way here. It's amazing to be back in the Dabru studio, and I'm thankful to my sister Daniela and the incredible people at Dabru. So thank you for being with us today.
No, it's my pleasure.
So, Rabbi, there's a lot to talk about, but let's start with the book. Let's start with good news. Let's start with that which all can rally around, agree with, be inspired by, something not controversial whatsoever. What's the genesis? What brought you to this? Is it simply a collection of articles you've written? Is there new material? What is it about these people that qualified them to make the book?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not a very efficient person. So while I've long wanted to put together a book of articles on different subjects, and I could put together 5 or 6 books like this, somebody came to me and he said he had selected out articles that were dealing with people, and he said, what do I think about publishing? He thought that he was going to get in the book publishing business. He was looking for something to do. And he basically selected the pieces, which is probably why the piece on your Schwer got left out, which should have definitely been there. And he came up with the idea. You would think, okay, he's selected the articles. The articles have already been published. They've already been edited. It should go real chick-chack.
Right.
To show you how ill-suited I am for this task, it took probably 4 or 5 years to get everything done. It needed a glossary. He wanted it to be a book that would provide a different perspective on the Orthodox world. He himself is not from the Haredi world, but he thought, somebody who can write articulately about a wide variety of subjects, who's as much the product of University of Chicago and Yale Law School as he is the product of the yeshiva world. I mean, I like to think I've become more of a product of the latter, but and show that community and show an ability to deal with a wide range of people. And we have on George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Margaret Thatcher as well. And a lot of interviews with, Yehuda Avner, who wrote the prime ministers, and Robert Wistrich, who was the greatest authority on contemporary anti-Semitism. So it's a wide-ranging book. It's also a personal book.
What was the goal of the book? To put this together, what do you hope that the reader walks away with? How do you want to transform them?
Well, I start on the flap cover with this quote from George Eliot. Somebody said to me, you'll have to explain to most of your readers that George Eliot was a woman. But George Eliot says in Middlemarch, she talks about those who lie in unmarked graves, but for whom the world would not be quite as well with you and I as it is because they lived. How many special people there are around us. And if you look everywhere, they're everywhere. I was just thinking yesterday, I look at American politics. I can't believe that a country of 350 million could have come to this, and these should be the choices that are confronting us.
Such a poor reflection of us. This is how unworthy we are as a generation.
Well, H.L. Mencken said that democracy is a system by which the people get what they want, good and hard. So if this is what we want, it's sad. I look at the situation in Israel, the tremendous divisions that existed prior to October 7th, and I'm also And then I look around at my community. I just look at the people who I daven next to in shul. There are pieces, a number of pieces here about people who passed away who I daven next to in shul. Some of them I never even talked to because I realized that their time was so precious to them that it would be a waste of time for me to engage them, even when I knew that, one of them had pancreatic cancer and wasn't going to be there long. But I figured, I just saw who he was, but I observed him from afar. And then I'm excited. I know so many remarkable people. Partly I was able to bring out in this book my mentors. I could talk about Rav Nachman Buhlman in our first conversation when I thought we came here on our honeymoon thinking we were going to go back and I would become a conservative rabbi. I never opened up a Gemara. I was 27 years old. And he told me, don't become a rabbi. He says,
it's good advice. It was good advice. Not all of us listened or got it, but it was good advice.
So I have, and Rav Mendel Weinbach and most powerfully for me, Rav Nissen Walpen, the editor of the Jewish Observer, who was, basically an older brother to me. I'm the oldest of 5 boys, and he was an older brother to me, and he was a second father because just as my father, Olav Shalom, guided me in the world into which I was born, he guided me into a world in which I entered, and I couldn't have done it as felicitously without him. That's for sure.
That contrast between the leadership and the people that you describe, leadership maybe reflects our unworthiness, but the people, the ordinary people who otherwise might be invisible, it's part of the story of October 7th, where the authority, the political leadership, and the military leadership sort of disappeared or fell apart or failed, but it was the ordinary citizens, whether it was ordinary citizens who took up arms to volunteer security forces, whether it was volunteers of Hatzalah and Zaka and others who rushed right into the danger. And that contrast, that juxtaposition is sort of that story also until it regrouped in this last year and what the army has done. But 100% all around us are, I always think of it as ordinary people leading extraordinary lives.
Right.
And how I feel it more, and I wonder whether you see this or how it's reflected in the ratio in the book. I definitely feel it more here than I do outside of Israel. And maybe that's part of my romanticizing Israel, that on an ordinary bus ride, the person who maybe has the Tehillim open or the Chumash open or sitting next to you is some extraordinary Baal Chesed or somebody who is a walking huge Talmid Chacham, but nobody even notices them or knows them. Less so outside of Israel. Do you think that's accurate, or is that romanticized vision from someone who lives outside of Israel?
I don't know. I've been here so long, it's hard for me to tell. And this is... I definitely think that there is so much in the world in which I live and so many people, but many of them are products of American society. They may live here now. Let's say we were just talking about Rav David Miller. Okay, so he grew up in America.
Right.
He's a person you can see, you could talk to him, and here's somebody who's always asking himself the question, what does a Kadosh Baruch Hu want from me at this moment? And you see it bechush. My wife tells me that I'm an idealizer. In other words, I tend to see people in rose-colored glasses, and I'm actually happy I do. But my kids told me when it came to shidduchim, I could tell them, I know the parents, the grandparents, and I even know one of the great-grandparents, and they would ignore me. And then 3 months later, they'd hear that somebody on the shidduch list is a friend of a friend's sister in Beis Yaakov, and then they'd be really willing to listen to it. And I'd say, what's going on here? He says, Abba, you like everybody.
Right.
Your investigations.
You discount. You have no credibility.
You have no credibility on this. And I think it's maybe the most valuable lesson I've given to my kids. Look for the good in everybody and look for the good. Take it away and see how you can apply it to your life. And if you do that,
right,
you're going to have a happier life. Learn to smile at people. The scientific studies show that smiling is one of the great uplifts, and the response that you get when you smile at somebody and they smile back at you, and almost everybody smiles back.
For sure.
And you feel that they also are lifted up.
Yeah. There's evidence scientifically smiling is as contagious as a yawn. The same way in a room. And as a rabbi, I know this well. One person yawns and it sets off a string of yawning. The same is true scientifically.
So you better get started with a good joke.
Got to get people smiling. And yeah. So given that you're this optimist or idealist or you see the best in people, was it hard to narrow down the profiles for the book?
No. I think, most of them are about people who are no longer living, most. But I know that there were articles that were left out. I simply didn't remember. I've written over 2,500 pieces over the years. Some of them are, some of these are very dear to me, on Rav Gusman or Rav Naftali Yehuda Mandelbaum, who was a Cheder Rebbe in Baltimore. But you've thrown yourself into them. You've investigated them. You've gone. That time, somebody who I knew at Or Sameach called me up and said there was a great man who was Nifter here. And when I was there interviewing in Baltimore, interviewing his kids and others, I felt like crying a lot of the time. I said, how could I have never known him? And then a friend of mine who did know him well said, oh, but he knew you. He used to comment when the English Yeted Neman started, oh, now there's something here to read. So this is a way of connecting. You can, somebody is nifter and you can write something about them, somebody unknown, but when their almana sees something in a book form, it's just such a wonderful way of connecting. The problem is that I travel a lot. So when you travel, I used to travel a lot, you meet new people and you throw yourself into the conversation always goes to 2 or 3 in the morning the first time. I think you may remember our Motzi Shabbos conversation. I don't think it went to 3 in the morning, but it can go a long time. And the problem is then you're trying to meet somebody new and you're trying to think about the things you'd most like to say about yourself. So much of that is in this book. I say it's basically my tzavah to my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, if Bezrat Hashem don't know how to read English. But we don't do that with the people around us. In other words, I've been in a shir every morning for more or less 20 years with some breaks here and there. And we're a group. We're definitely a group, as different as we are. We don't even see each other socially so much, by and large, but everybody has a place in that group. But you're not looking in the same way you are when you're meeting. I remember this with Ran Yitzhak Eisenman in Passaic and our conversations and many other conversations with people I may never have seen again. But we have to learn to be alert to the people around us, to be
curious about people. Would you recommend that? You're a writer with a big platform, like you said. You've written 2,500 articles. You've written many books. What number book are we up to?
I think this is 13.
13th book. And the average person is not necessarily researching or writing as a rabbi. You're constantly living life looking for the drasha story or the next article idea. But the average person doesn't feel the need to do that. There's so many people that I've been masped to give a hesped, a eulogy for them. And also, as I'm sitting with the family learning about the person, I say, can't believe that I didn't know this while they were alive. I didn't make more of an effort, or I couldn't have spent time, but there was so much to learn from them. And I think for the average person, they are in a community, they have a neighbor or friend or someone else in shul that if only they'd be a little curious about them, if they'd actually turn off a device, make some space, shut off the noise and listen, there's so much to learn. So how do you recommend people go about that if they're not going to do so with the agenda of putting it into a book or an article, but do it only with the agenda of being an Ohev Yisrael, of learning and being curious?
There's no doubt that being a writer helps. I mean, I remember from the time that I left, stopped editing the Yeted Ne'eman till then I started writing Reb Yaakov, Reb Dessler, Mike Tress. I wrote about 7 books in the first 10 years, Lieutenant Birnbaum, but I didn't have any ideas for columns when I didn't have to produce a column every week. There are other times I've written 3 columns a week regularly for different venues. You get it. You have as many ideas as you need to have. So the writing is definitely a big impetus. One thing everybody can do is learn to say thank you to the people who had an influence on them. It's good to sometimes to wake up in the morning and think, what would I have done if Miss Borman, my AP English teacher in high school, had not flunked me on my first essay senior year, which I'd sent off to Harvard as my application form, and I thought it was so great, and she said it was so miserable. And if all these people who took enough interest in me to tell me, you're not a very good writer. You don't know how to punctuate. You don't know what a dangling participial phrase is. But they thought you could get better. It's a gift to be able to write, but it's not something it's not fairy dust that's just sprinkled on you. you work at it, you read, you learn a lot, and you get better. But you need some people who will tell you you're not good enough. You could get better. You could do better.
So just being curious about the people who've gotten us to where we are. We tend to live life only looking forward, like what's next, as opposed to stopping and saying, this is the person that helped get me where I am.
Well, and of course, one of the dearest sections is that the chance that I had to memorialize my parents. I always thought about my parents, and my youngest brother, who passed away young. Baruch Hashem, he put out an important book of his own. Well, it was published posthumously, but it was Rays of Wisdom. But it's collected letters that he wrote to Talmidim in Mechon Yaakov when they went back to university or when they went back to the world. I mean, he had finished second in his class at Yale, and he had a perspective on that very few people, your average rabbi in the yeshiva is not going to have the same perspective, who wasn't a Greek classic civilizations major and able to deal with how do you relate to these things. They're not. Having a column is a big benefit, but learning everybody can learn to be more sensitive to look,
right,
to see, and I hope I'll open people up to that. If my kids say to me that your legacy is that we make more friends or we look for friends. I mean, not everybody needs to have hundreds of friends, and I don't think I need to have 100 friends either. But everybody needs somebody that they have a sprach with, and there's so many out there who are so different from one another. I mean, my best friend in Jerusalem right now, we met during COVID because we went to a 6:15 minyan in the morning on Shabbos, which adhered to the various separation requirements. And then we started talking the first Shabbos that we were there, and we found out that we had a lot to talk about. And it went on for hours. And I'd been living on the same street with him for 25 years. I mean, we were nodding acquaintances. We'd probably had a few conversations. I knew who he was, but I didn't know he could be such a great friend, and I didn't know he would be such a great chavrusa either. The nuggets are waiting there to be discovered.
They're right there. Of all the books that you've written, the personalities that you've covered, is there one that's your favorite that jumps out? From Rav Yaakov, Rav Noach, of course. Rav Noach was a
Did
work
you read
in
it?
Itself. Sure.
Because remember, I interviewed you for that.
Yeah.
And I think your story's in there, no?
I think so.
The story about not wanting to go down to Kikar Shabbat.
Yeah, that's it.
So
Rav Tesla, all these.
When you're writing them, the book, your favorite is always the one that you're writing at that time. I mean, Rabbi Yaakov will always occupy a special place in my heart because it was the first, and because I figured out what I wanted to do with a biography. What is the purpose of a Gadol biography? And the introduction there, I still use it whenever I say what should be in a Gadol biography. So it got me started, and I had a clear vision. I was a history major, so that's always very dear to me. And Rabbi Yaakov was, of course, such an attractive personality, and was one of my closest friends, partly through that book because he helped me translate some of the Yiddish interviews that have been done by Rav Nosson Kamenetsky. There's a chapter in the Mike Tress book where I found a trove of letters that had been written by soldiers in the DP camps after the war. And I realized that if I didn't do something with these letters, they would never be seen again. This was the last time they'd be seen, much less come out. And they told an amazing story of the mistreatment of Jews who had survived somehow in the DP camps, but of them coming back to life. So that chapter always has a special resonance with me because I knew I saved something from oblivion. It would not have been known. The last two books, Reb Noach and the Rav Schuster book. So I'm a product of the Baal Tshuva movement of the late 70s. And for the next 12 or 20 years, and I was able to basically portray a tekufa in history of which it wasn't just a tekufa, it was one which I lived through.
Right.
It doesn't exist anymore. It's, if Rav Schuster would appear on the scene today, there would be very few people at the kotel for him to pick up. It's a different world. But so that's obviously very meaningful for me to have been able to do that. And everybody lives off of Michtamei Eliyahu, so to read through Rav Dessler's letters. I mean, there are a lot of letters in volumes 4 and 5, and there's none that I don't have a lot of hana from, but in different ways.
So let's we can come back to, but I want to talk a little bit more globally or broadly, because one of the things that draws me to you, that I've always appreciated about you, is in a world that is so bifurcated, that people fit neatly into boxes, that they're tribal, that they're part of a camp, that they toe a line. You always come across to me as very nuanced. And your column over the last year in Mishpacha, for example, has not hesitated to memorialize heroic soldiers who've lost their lives, to speak glowingly about them or their families, that you have featured personalities who may not be from the same camp that you're part of. Rabbi Tarragon, I remember you wrote about so
love
beautifully.
Rabbi Tarragon.
He's fantastic. I do too, but we live in a world where as much as in the progressive woke world, there's a fear of being canceled, or there's the canceling movement. In the frum world, there's also a very big canceling movement, and people are very afraid. If I say this, if I allude to that, if I reflect that, then the mob, the zealots, the kanam are going to come after me. They're going to cancel me. And you have identified for a long time as with the Haredi world, and for a period were the spokesperson in some ways of the Haredi world. In your bio, I think back when you came to Boca still, you were trying to represent eloquently, articulately, compellingly some of the policies or approaches of the Haredi world who didn't have somebody who had the vocabulary to do that, or the sensitivity or nuance to be able to do that. So I think that you have nuance. You don't fit neatly in, even if you identify with or put your children through a particular world. But as much as on October 8th, there was this almost unprecedented achdus in our lifetime, in the weeks and months, and now more than a year that's passed since then, a lot of those energies of divisiveness have reintroduced. Obviously surrounding the issue of serving in the army, an enormous one. Even less than that, I shouldn't say less, but different than that, is a sense some people have of the Haredi world, even if they're not ready to transform and to begin to serve, which would be a radical shift. But do they feel the sympathy and the empathy? Rav Lopiansky, we both admire, just wrote I think, incredibly powerful, and I thanked him. I didn't use the word courage because I'm not in a place to thank him for that part, but I thanked him for writing it because he made that exact point. Why can't Haredi newspapers feature profiles on soldiers, B'nai Torah and not, who gave their lives? Why don't people feel that sympathy? You mentioned Rav Miller. I saw him yesterday coming out of a Shiva call. Rav David Miller, my Rebbe, Mari Varabi, one of the most extraordinary people that I know.
Me too.
And he said to me, and he's almost unsolicited, he just wanted to share, and I hope it's okay, I'm repeating. He listed off 3 or 4 recent simchas in his family of the birth of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and engagements. And he said, as much as I have all these simchas, I don't feel them fully because I'm broken. And that, so is the average person in the Haredi community feeling that brokenness? I don't mean the fear of when sirens go off. Did this Simchas Torah, was it reflected? If God forbid, 1,200 people in Lakewood or Monsey or Passaic would have died in a pogrom last year, would anyone in Eretz Yisrael have had Simchas Torah as usual, or would they have paused to introduce something to reflect? So because it happened in Israel with all of the... So I'm not putting you on the spot or expecting you to be able to stand here, represent everyone. The Haredi world's a big place and a lot of segments of it. Has it been hard for you, who's a person who identifies with a community but lives with a nuance, to feel connected, to reflect, to feel responsible for? How do you sort of make sense of that?
So I always look for the models. Rav Aaron Lopiansky, I consider the wisest person I know. So his article didn't surprise me. Everybody has seen the clip of Rav Asher Weiss talking about my children's dermatologist grandson who lost 3 limbs, I believe, and whom I continue to daven for every day, and talking about the shilas that were asked. I've written about the Rav from Alon Shvut,
Rav Rimon,
and the shilas that I have a whole column of the kinds of shilas that he's imposed. But there, and Rav Asher Weiss was talking about the shilas that he was asked about how to put on tefillin and so forth. I don't have to be embarrassed about anything, because if Rav Asher Weiss, who's a Weltgaon, and as long as I have my models and I know that I'm within, I don't have to be in the consensus of everybody. You know, the olam's always a little bit of a golem, but I think I'd like to know that I pass this on to my children. When my son-in-law told me that my grandson, who's 18 years old in Hebron Yeshiva, a little bit independent-minded any event, but has been fasting every Monday and Thursday since the beginning of the war. That was exciting to me. I have a daughter-in-law who cooks every week for soldiers. And I'm also very involved in an organization called Kesher Yehudi, which you know from the columns. Now, my wife and I have been present both at a Shabbaton for hostage families and families of hostages, and a Shabbaton for survivors of the Nova Festival. But they've done 3 Shabbatons, and that was all financed by almost one Jew in America who's put almost $500,000. I don't know exactly the figures, but I would say close to $500,000 in providing Shabbatons. And if you would see some of the clips of people there with, rings through their noses and so forth, and what this has meant to them. And we were just at Kavash Shnios on mostly Simchas Torah, but they had done a Simchas Torah in the hotel, and they told me that the bidding was there. The survivors of Nova were bidding for Aliyahs with how many Shabbatot they were going to keep. There is so much potential in this country. There's a real awakening. There's a real Jewish awakening on campuses in America. There's an awakening. I mean, as one rabbi put it from in the Meor program at NYU, somebody said to him, if they hate us this much, there must be much more to Judaism than lox and bagels.
Absolutely.
And I think that anti-Semitism is one of the most powerful tools. It's, you take the fact that we are the smallest people. We've been hated for 3,000 years in every different form, and it's always fluid and changing, shape-shifting hatred, but it's always there or waiting there. I mean, I didn't know that growing up. I never expected to see anything like what we've seen. I mean, these are the playgrounds in which I was comfortable and happy and excited and intellectually nurtured have become bastions of insanity. My grandfather, already a Sloan-born grandfather, went to Harvard, and so these places have become what they have. What they have is almost unfathomable to me. But that we're the only people in the world that can still trace itself. If we would walk into the Beis Midrash in Pumdisa, we would still be able to partake in the discussion there, that we can trace ourselves back so far, and our identity is clear. There's no other people on the face of the earth, so we're the most hated, and we're the only ones who exist. This is a powerful tool. One of the former Raphael Shore, who's done about 19 films, has just done a new film and produced a new book where he says,
he's coming to our show to talk about it.
Yeah?
Show it. Mm-hmm.
You've seen it.
I haven't seen it. He's coming to Boca.
It's very important. I used to give a speech called Anti-Semitism, an Optimist View. They hate us because they feel our chosenness. Shouldn't we also tune into that? But he says, if you want to understand anti-Semitism, you have to read Mein Kampf. And he does a pretty compelling case of showing how that is the case, that there's a cosmic war. Robert Wistrich told me that everybody who set out to destroy the Jewish people, almost immediately, no matter how, if the Shah was so with them, they went down. The minute that Hitler at the Wannsee conference decided that they were going to wipe out all the Jews in the world, he started making one bad decision after another to go into Russia instead of first taking care of England and so forth. Inexplicable decisions. Let them go at Dunkirk and inexplicable decisions. But you see, it's an amazing story, and they are waking up. The college Meor, I think, is on 20 campuses, and they said they don't have enough room, they don't have enough staff, they can't handle all kids who are seeking shelter by them, but they're also seeking to learn. And then they want to know, I want to identify as a Jew. Josh Friedman, who you probably know, lives in Ramat Beit Shemesh. He's given away 8,000 pairs of tefillin. I'm sure 100 at least come from Boca, maybe 1,000. But, he's given away 8,000. And those are only to soldiers who are committed to putting them on.
Yeah.
If we could get beyond some of the political issues, the chances for spreading Torah in Eretz Yisrael.
So are you frustrated by that? Are you frustrated by, on both sides, Haredi leadership? I'm not talking about not necessarily Gedolim, but political leaders. There seem to be people who have made a living off of the division and are very dug in on ensuring that ideologies are not confused or overlapped or corrupted. Whereas, if we could get to the people, there are extraordinary demonstrations, which, coming back to your book, is really what it's about, of the ability to find common ground, to love each other, to work together, to find solutions instead of focusing on problems. Are they intractable? Is there no solution? What's going to be? It's a different time.
It is a different time. I mean, we learned, Rav Tamar Granot, who's a Rosh Yeshiva of a Hesder Yeshiva in Tel Aviv, I think a musically oriented Hesder Yeshiva, said the other day, we all believed for a long time we didn't really need the Haredim in the army. But, it's a difference in kind when reservists are serving 300 days. Even if you come back shalem, in body at least, not injured, not wounded, not killed, chas v'sholem. But the strain that this puts on families is unbelievable. But I think, the story that really captures what could be done and has been done, and by people who are alert to it, there's a woman who is one of the leaders of the hostage families named Shelley Shem Tov. And there was a clip of her literally screaming at the Kikar in Tel Aviv that, don't you understand, this didn't happen stam. My Omer is not in Gaza for nothing. He's Omer because we were fighting with each other for a year. Achenu anachnu, achenu. V'dai. So Sili Schneider, who's been running a program which works with all the 30 mechinot, the K'dam Tzvayot, the pre-induction academies for almost 10 years now, saw this, and she just went down to the Kikar in Tel Aviv to give her a hug. And from that came, at the first Shabbaton, I think 70 hostages, members of hostage families signed up to have a regular chavrusa. Beneath the surface, there's so much that can be done. And Rav Lopiansky is right. Anyone who doesn't show, who doesn't feel, who doesn't know, when you learn, if you're in Hebron Yeshiva, at the very least feel that you're a chelik of this. Do I have the right to go out to do this thing, to go on a tour? But, one of the things that was most powerful, they took a group of, I suspect, non-religious Jews to see Rav Yitzhak Kolodowski. He's the son-in-law of Rav Chaim. And his wife showed them, he's been sleeping on a board since the beginning of the war. Rav David Miller told me yesterday that Rav Farbstein, one of the Rosh Yeshivas of Hebron, comes into the Beis Midrash every day, and when he recites Tehillim, he's sobbing. The big people always identified. They always identified. And I have a piece there about Rav Shach, who he could do an operation without anesthesia because he didn't want to be left unable to learn. But when he heard about the two Masokim, the two helicopters that collided and 76 boys were killed, it was inconsolable. One of the advantages of the Gadol biographies that I've written, maybe their greatest merit, see the way Rabbi Yaakov looked at the Jewish people, thought about every Jew, how Rav Dessler didn't sleep on a bed during the whole war period. He didn't sleep in a bed. He traveled from one place to another. Rav Shragel Feivel Mendelovitz had his fatal heart attack while benching when he got to Bnei Yerushalayim over thinking of the siege that Jerusalem was over. These are the people.
So who am I to say that we're an orphan generation, but it feels like we're lacking a little bit of that leadership today, because the Rechaim Shmulevitz during the Yom Kippur War, the 6th Day War, those statements, that demonstration, and you're describing, but it's not as well known. And, yes, Rav Sholot, the Gerer Yeshiva I'm privileged to have a relationship with, went to the Gush Beis Medrash and gave a eulogy for a Talmud who was killed, who he was close with, unafraid. But there, and Rav Asher Weiss, and I think they've even paid a price for the chink in the armor, or for demonstrating that others might perceive as crossing a line or a camp. It's sad, and we need to celebrate more those types of leaders and recognize, and again, without pointing fingers at others, each of us in our own way, be able to recognize in others the good. But those forces,
I don't
energies.
think we know everything. I think that we don't know everything that's being done, even of those who you might say, well, they're not doing enough about this. I mean, Rav Dov Landau is considered one of the two leaders of the Haredi world today. He wrote, and I think this is a little bit of justice. He said, we want to talk to the army. First of all, we need to protect ourselves. My son lives in Achisamach. It's next to Lud. Lud is a town filled with lots of guns, lots of Arabs, and Achisamach is unprotected. We should have our own civil defense. There's so much work that needs to be done in a civil defense capacity. There are so many things that can be done. He says, we can't, but it doesn't matter what the army agrees to. I mean, Rav Granot said yesterday, the army's made lots of mistakes. Over the years, the army's made lots of mistakes, and anyone who would, see they're trying to force on women singing as if it was a priority, or mixed battalions as if they were priorities. What Rav David Fendel tells us about is the Hellenization of our soldiers there. The army's made lots of mistakes, but the army wants to be metaken, or there are those in the army certainly who want to be metaken.
Are you hopeful? The optimism in you that you described before, is there optimism that says whether now or in the aftermath, there's an opportunity to write a new chapter and you can't start from scratch, but basically say, what would it need to look like? And are there enough interest on both sides to create what it would need to look like in order to find a solution to this?
Well, don't Jews have to be hopeful? I mean, we do believe in Mashiach. We do believe that history is moving to an end. We are helpful. I mean, I have a friend of mine who was called up once, and he was interviewed, his health profile. And then the person said, and what's your religious identity? And he said, well, you guess. And he said, well, I'm guessing that you're Haredi. This man is now in his late 80s and still learning every day, with a bread in the yeshiva. He says, and he said, why did you say that? He says, you're generally optimistic. Believers are optimistic. We are optimistic. I believe in the Jewish people. I've been involved enough behind the scenes with people who had a breadth of vision, and I didn't even include Rav Moshe Sher when I was talking about the biographies, who had a breadth of vision. And that's my job, is to bring out that breadth of vision and to demonstrate it too. One of the things on October 7th, one of the people who went down, just picked up his rifle and went down, was a guy named Yair Golan, the leader of the opposition in the Knesset. And a person who said awful things about Judah. He's called the settlers Judo Nazis, and he said some awful things. But in the end of the day, he also picked up his gun and went down to defend one of the kibbutzim, or not to rescue them. We always have to look at the good. I remember one of the leaders of the Labor Party once, somebody whose politics were somewhat anathema to me, but I started reading something about Avram Rabinowitz had a book on the I guess it was on the Yom Kippur War, and how he pulled himself. He had his arm practically blown off and pulled himself into 3 different tanks when the tank that he was in was disabled. He pulled himself into another. We always have to remember who these people are, what they've sacrificed, who these, when they have 150% showing up for Miluim, many of them people who have been living in America for 15 years.
Yeah.
You just look for the good, look for the good.
one of our Chassanim on Simchas Torah in Boca Raton. He's a young man who grew up in our community who had served in the army. His parents are Israeli, but he's been out for several years. But when he heard the news October 7th, the first flight, the next day he rejoined, and he spent the last 10 months fighting in Gaza and in Lebanon. And he was back in Boca, and we made him one of the Chassanim. And in addition to the chuppah on the bima, where he would get his aliyah, they lifted him on a chair with a chuppah over him, and people were waving flags and singing Am Yisrael Chai.
Yeah,
and it was so powerful.
And there was a chassid at the airport when the first reservists were going back, paying for every ticket for everybody who was going back. There's a lot more identification than you think. I remember I used to go into the 16th Avenue Tells Minion in the morning in Borough Park, and people would ask me, what's the latest news from Eretz Yisrael? But I realized that they were better informed than me, that half these people sit at work with Arutz Sheva on their radio. I mean, they're Haredi businessmen, but they sit with Arutz Sheva on their, on the hour. They're listening all the time. They're completely involved. It is, just to remember that we are part of a people and that everybody is part of that. The basic lessons that we're all in this together, that if the Iranians, chas v'sholom, get a nuclear weapon, and they call Israel a one-bomb country, we're all in this together. We have to find a way out of this. One of the most hopeful statements that I always quote in my lectures on the Haredi community is that trends that can't continue forever won't. I mean, it's a statement made by a famous economist, but it's applicable to everything. Societies change. All societies change. There's always a pendular motion and then a readjustment. We're not the same world we were but it's good to know that in the 1948 war, in Milchemet HaShichur, lots of Rosh Hashiva's sons also fought. Rav Chatzkel Sarno, the Rosh Hashiva of Hebron, one of the Vishnitzer, Seret Vishnitzer Rebbe's sons, was people, there was no choice. You have to be at the battlements. And we have to find some way to limit this, the burden on reservists. Not everybody stays in yeshiva forever. The burden under which they face, but you need some prior military training to be of any use. You can't just walk into Lebanon.
Do you find in your writing, do you get censored or do you have to self-censor? One of the things, again, I appreciate about your articles is you'll come back from a conference, you'll reference and you'll quote non-religious Jews, non-Jews. You'll reference articles in legacy media in America, newspapers who I don't even like to mention their name in front of the Aron Kodesh. But you're not afraid to incorporate those into your writings. Do you get censored ever to say, hey, whoa, this is a certain type of a magazine, or I don't want to pick on Mishpacha, I love Mishpacha. Is there elsewhere? Or do you self-censor? Are you worried about your children, grandchildren getting shidduchim if, Rabbi Rosenblum is a Haredi, but he's not so Haredi. Look what he's reading. Look who he's quoting. Look at the ideas he's exposed to. Look who he's exposing others to. Have you gotten censored? Do you have to self-censor?
I have my old friend Natan Slifkin, who always likes to go through my writings and out me as not really Haredi or something like that. I'm always out of the closet to some extent. And one Purim issue of Mishpacha, one of the then Mevaker of the magazine said, my job here is to make sure that Yonasan Rosenblum doesn't get us closed down. So, but I don't find, I find that my fellow writers are pretty broad-minded. The editor, Shana Friedman, is one of the brightest, best-read people whom I know. But I think we do learn, we all learn how to put our messages in a different fashion. Sometimes one of my brothers once said to me, he said, Jonathan, my youngest brother, Olav Shalom, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, really, he said to me, you think nobody figures out what you're saying? Believe me, there are plenty of people who are onto you. Don't think that.
Sure.
Don't think that your whatever heterodox views you have are not known. And people say to me things like, "Who gives you the right to write about this?" I have had people stop me. I had a young man from Brisk at my own table ask me, "Who's your Das Torah? Who's your Das Torah?" So I said, he had invited himself to come for, so finally I said, Rav Aaron Lopiansky, so one of my sons who was at the table, he says, Abba, you have to have that answer faster.
Took too long. Took too long.
Took you too long, but don't invite him back again. This is not somebody you want in your house.
Yeah. But, that in itself is a reflection a little bit of our time. Your life experience and your journey and your relationship with big people helps you understand when you need to check whether you're pushing the envelope, when you're comfortable being a big person yourself, big enough person yourself to publish something. And some of the younger, this generation is living in a world, like I say, of these boxes and absolutes and a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity, religious insecurity. So
sometimes it's ignorance too. One of my sons once said to me, when he was learning in the mirror, already as an Avreik, he said to me, we're not anti-Zionists. The only real anti-Zionists are these Americans. They come here and they just spout things, but they don't know what they're talking about. They're for Brent, but they're for Brent because it's just ideology to them. It's not the people on the street. They're not involved. One of my sons said to me, listen, there are many people who want to stay Haredi, but they also want to be part of Israeli society. I don't know what the percentages are. I'm not a sociologist. I haven't done the research. But, I listen a lot to what my kids tell me. He said, and part of the markers of being a member of Israeli society is at some point army service. Now, that one is doing Miluim now, but he's in law school. Why shouldn't he be doing Miluim? It's not a patur that you once learned full-time in Hebron Yeshiva. If you're now in law school and
was it controversial that he did army service or he's doing Miluim?
No.
Does that make him not a member of the Haredi community?
That alone, for sure not. I mean, I don't know if he still identifies as a member of the Haredi community. But in our building, we had at least 10, in one single building in Har Nof, and I think all the parents would probably identify themselves as Haredi, but there were at least 10 boys in the building who have served in the army, many who did Nachal Haredi. So obviously we're an outlier to some extent. That wouldn't be true in my daughter's neighborhood in Bnei Brak. But, a number of my children tried to enlist and were not successful. They weren't taken for one reason or another. That desire, and I think it's certainly positive. I mean, not that I think that a person who's really, ligging and learning and is the one pushing the envelope furthest in the Haredi world probably is my friend Yoshua Pfeffer.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I don't think his sons. I'm not 100% sure. I don't think that they went into the army. I mean, I'm sure they're brilliant, and I'm sure that they're, top students and so forth. But I never had that conversation with him because, that's a conversation. We each have to make our individual decisions, and our children have to make theirs because we don't make them for them.
That's true. There's a lot to be optimistic, a lot to look for. The ordinary greatness around us and those people, that general attitude that you have and that comes across in your writing, in your column that we're so grateful for, is important. And hopefully we can turn off some of the noise and in fact just focus on the people and the good things and the trends, and hopefully there's a positive, there's a reset, a reboot to Klal Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am HaNetzach, that's happened in many ways, this awakening that you're describing. Where can people find the new book?
Well, Feldheim online is probably the easiest. I didn't take a major publisher. I didn't take a major publisher, and it turns out to sell books, you have to get shelf space in the bookstores. And for that, you need to be either Art Scroll. I mean, in some ways, Rabbi Sherman surprised me, said, we would have been happy to take this book. And I said, you told me the last time you previously published works that it sold 7 copies. He said, you would have been different. There's a big thing, the advertising apparatus. But Feldheim online, online, Amazon. But and in your local bookstore, I want to help the local bookstores. I'd like the local bookstores to be there. But if I got this, if this message gets across, then I consider myself well satisfied. Even if it's only a tzava for my grandchildren, it will be good enough. But
we're looking forward. Thank you for this book. Thank you for all your writing and all your work, your optimism, your smile, your positivity. And thank you for letting us go behind the bima with you today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.